Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Environment Week and our Native Bees 101 presentation for Pollinator Day. So my name is Ginny, and I'm the Environment and Sustainability Specialist here at the Town of Okotoks. Environment Week is happening all week this week until Saturday, and something has been posted online every day this week, whether it's fun activities you can do at home or videos of our online learning sessions. So everything can be found at okotoks.ca/environmental events. Now, tonight we're going to talk all about Alberta's amazing native bee species. Our presenter, Alexandria Farmer, is a pollination ecologist and professor at Mount Royal University. So we're going to be taking questions throughout the presentation, potentially after each slide, every other slide, whenever Lexi lets me know when we're asking questions, and we'll also have some at the, time at the end of the presentation as well. So you can click on the Q&A option that you see at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We will do our best to get to all of them tonight. If we can't, we will answer you via email later next week. So before Lexi gets started on her presentation, we're going to do a quick poll to test your knowledge about bees. So once the poll pops up on your screen, please go ahead and answer, and I will let you know the results in just one moment. So hold on here. Let's get this up. Oh, it looks like we're doing all three questions at once, Lexi. Sorry, I didn't realize how this works.
That's just fine.
So let all of you vote who are in on this right now, and we're not going to let you know what the actual answers to the questions are right now, as Lexi's going to be talking about them throughout her presentation. All right, still 10 of you to vote.
Fair, I don't get to vote.
Sorry. Almost done. Get in your votes. All right, so I'll just say what we got here so far. So how many different native bees live in Alberta? Most of you are saying around 30. 3 of you said 300, 3 said 100, and 2 of you said 5. All right. Are honeybees native to North America? 7 of you said no way, and 5 of you said they sure are. Oh, 6 of you now have said they sure are. And does a bee die when it stings you? We have 7 saying yes and 6 saying no. All right, that is really interesting. Okay, so we're going to find out the answers to those questions throughout the next hour. And I guess now is a good time just to say thank you, Lexi or Alexandria, whichever you want to go by, for joining us this evening. So please go ahead and teach us all about bees.
All right, well, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. My title slide here just shows myself, my close friend Megan Evans, who's a co-founder, she's the president of the Alberta Native Bee Council, my chubby-headed little girl, and nest boxes that we were building at that time, probably 10 years ago now. So they matched the color of my slide, so that's why I used it. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of insects in general, and then I'm going to dive right into the importance of our native bee diversity. We're going to look at some of the locals, and of course why we're concerned. I mean, anytime you study an organism, especially if you're dealing with government, why should we care? So that's a big thing in trying to get people involved, is understanding why we're concerned and why should we care. Then we're going to talk about how we can help the bees. And in a world of internet misinformation, the do's and don'ts of bee conservation, it's really important to try to channel your way through all this information and figure out what's good information and what maybe isn't quite so accurate. So we're going to talk about creating habitat for bees, gardening for them, nesting, so that's all involved with creating the habitat, is where will they nest and what will we plant for them. So Just to start with, I mean, a lot of people don't value insects. I know as growing up, I hated all insects. I was terrified of them. I blame my mother. Uh, but, you know, it wasn't until I went to university and decided that I needed to get over my fear of these creatures. And so the best way to do that was to take an entomology course. And I ended up taking every entomology course I could to get over that. And now, of course, I love all creatures, and my kids want to move out. So I bring them home in my pockets. It's the other way around. So I mean, you know, the importance, it's fundamental, really, or foundational, when we look at something like nutrient cycling. And so that top middle picture of that glorious beetle, that's a necrophorus beetle, and the reason you don't see dead mammals everywhere when you're out hiking is because these beetles actually burrow under the carcasses of dead animals and slowly bury them and then lay their eggs inside them. And so this, of course, is an excellent way for nutrient cycling. Same with little roly-polies, those little armadillo beetles that you might see when you lift up your mat outside. They would also be really good for nutrient cycling, bringing in dying, in that case, organic, you know, leaf matter and so on. Pest control. So we've all seen the glorious ladybugs and the work they do. And you know, the picture I have here from Insects of Alberta shows the two-spotted ladybug, which is a native species, but there's concern over the introduction of numerous non-native species for pest control into greenhouse environments, which then spilled out into natural populations. And so it's, again, a good example of how sometimes when we try to manage things, we can potentially mess them up. And so we've actually seen a decline in our two-spotted ladybug. Of course, you know, insects tend to be, when you look at food webs, they're definitely a foundational organism. So my picture of some aquatic nymph and larval stages duking it out here, I think that's a nymph stage of a dragonfly and munching away. So, you know, they eat each other, and then the toads and the frogs, the amphibians eat them, and so on and so on and so on. I tried to get a really good, you know, other images of this, but all I could come up with was nasty toe biter beetles eating poor innocent frogs, so I left that out. And of course, the focus of our talk today, you know, the importance of pollinators and our native pollinators. And so, you know, that beautiful bombus flavifrons in the top right corner, just nestling in on some nice Indian paintbrush. So pollination by wild bees is oftentimes overlooked in terms of its importance. And so it's something that we really want to focus on when I'm talking today, as far as, you know, we always focus on bringing in the honeybees and you know, the leafcutter bees, but really these native bees are doing the lion's share of the work. So you know, when we talk about our insects, anecdotal evidence of this, but I grew up in Grand Prairie and all my family was in Calgary, and so we drove across Alberta what felt like 100 times a year, and especially in the summertime months, and you had to go from one town to the next. You'd have to use your windshield wipers to clear the dead insects off of the windshield to even be able to see. And nowadays I can go what feels like an entire summer without having to wash my windshield for lack of these insects. So, you know, this study by Hallman et al., which has received some criticism, but, you know, it said that 75% decline in our insect biomass over these last 27 years, and some 40% of these insects species run a risk of extinction over the next few decades. So it's certainly alarming when you look at their incredible ecosystem service, you know, pollinators aside, but, you know, insects in general. So, and they all basically are under the same pressures in terms of things that are leading to their demise. So when we look at native bee diversity, I was really curious by the response. You know, most people thought there'd be around 30 native bees. A few thought 300, and so the three of you that said 300, you're the prize winners today. This is a really neat graphic by a prof out of, oh gosh, I meant to put this down. I can't remember now, but a university, and Virginia, that's it, Virginia University. And so this is a really neat graphic just showing you the differences in the sizes. So you see those huge bumblebees in the top and cycling down through different mason bees, leafcutter bees, mining bees, sweat bees, and then down to the teeny tiny one. I don't know, can they see my little cursor, Ginny?
Yes, they can.
Okay, well, that's handy. So just down to the tiniest of bees, the perdita. And so when I teach this to children, I say, okay, like put your fingers together, you know, your thumb and your pointer finger, and then separate them just a little tiny bit, and that's the size of the smallest bee. And if you hold your thumb up, you know, that's the size of some of our largest bees. So it's incredible diversity. And the fact of the matter is, across the planet, we have well over 20,000 species. Some studies say well over 27,000 species. It just depends. We have over 4,000 species here in North America, well over 800 in Canada, and right here in our beautiful province of Alberta, we have well over 300 species. So I think last recorded value I read was 327, so that's close enough to 300. And a friend of mine, Lincoln Best, who's the best bee taxonomist, I would argue, in the world, he's found, you know, he discovers new species all the time. So, you know, it's just as we discover them, that number grows. Now, most of these species are solitary bees, and what that means is that they don't form colonies like our bumblebees would here. So most of them are nesting in the ground, and some in stems, and, you know, opportunistically, I'll show you some videos where they just nest in anything they can. So it's really interesting to see how humans have impacted their nesting behavior. It's really hard to identify a bee. So while you know, some people will call me a bee expert, I hate those words because I'm anything but I love studying their ecology, and certainly have a focus on bumblebees. But if you look at this graphic, this is a great graphic for showing you. So this is out of the Bees in Your Backyard, a phenomenal resource. I meant to actually show it to you, but I thought I was on video too, so I'll just have to, I can send that link to Ginny as well. It's not an expensive book. You can get it on Amazon for like 26 bucks, and it's just so fun. So this graphic shows you these wasps on the right, and you can see there's incredible diversity here. I would assume or guess most of you recognize this as a wasp, but you probably wouldn't recognize this red wasp or green wasps and blue wasps. And again, many of these are solitary wasps. And then we see these bees that are closely mimicking these wasps. And they'll say things like, well, if you read the keys for them, well, if you look at the hairs on them and they're just straight, as opposed to if they're branching, you can distinguish if they're a wasp or a bee. And I don't know about you, but I'm not going to get nose to nose with a wasp. And then, of course, we have, you know, the flies on the left here. So they're mimicking the bees. So it's kind of like, we all know that wasps are jerks. They're carnivorous for the most part. And then we have these bees that, you know, they can sting you, but really they're nectivores, meaning they really just like pollen and nectar. And then flies really have nothing going for them. So their best bet is to put on the leather jacket of coolness, which is looking like a bee or a wasp. And so it's really fun when you look at some of the, you know, results of this. So for example, Lawrence Packer, he's an incredible bumbologist, but he put out a book, Keeping the Bees. It's a great book if you're interested, but he's talking about bumblebees throughout this book. At any rate, when they put out their first, you know, the editors put out this first copy, this had a picture of a fly mimic on the front of the book rather than a bee. And I used to get tricked by this as well. When I would be out doing field work, I'd start chasing bumblebee mimics, and I would end up accidentally following them until they landed in piles of cow pies or poop, and then I knew that they had to have been a fly. So, and then this is another one, Bees of the World, where here we see a big glorious fly on the cover of this incredible book. So it's kind of interesting. You really do have to have a keen eye to be able to distinguish species. So here, I just threw this in for fun, because wasps are actually the ancestors of bees, and I kind of joke that, you know, the bees are the effect of the mutation that took the jerkiness out of them. And so, you know, the wasps that we'd be looking at, and short-tongued wasps that were out foraging on the odd flower, they would have been consuming pollen and nectar, just like bees would. But what's curious is that pollen has a very similar chemical composition or nutritional composition that insect bodies do. And so, you know, the odd wasp might have chosen to start foraging selectively on pollen, which of course we start to see that segregation, and, you know, a few million years later you have bees, so give or take. So it's kind of an interesting story there. So how much native bee diversity is there? We've already talked about there being over 300 across the province. Here's a neat little study, Lincoln Best, through the University of Calgary, and he was a big part of helping to set up the Canyon Meadows Bee Boulevard, which I'll be highlighting in a minute, but he did some sampling within that bee boulevard, and this is just one locality, and he actually found that there was over 100 native species just in that one locality, including different specialists. So most of our bees are generalists, but he found some specialist bees. There was 15 species of bumblebees, and including some endangered species, and I'll highlight those in a bit as well. And so then ultimately found that we had over 20 genera of native bees in Calgary, so 20 large groupings of bees, which are pretty big findings. And of course, looking at how that broke down just within the bee boulevard, we see a huge abundance of these halictid bees, these sweat bees we'll talk about, along with the Lacea glossum bees. So here's some pictures of these types of bees. And while this halictid is very bee-like in terms of being black and yellow, it could easily be mistaken for a wasp. And certainly this one, without that distinguishing characteristic of those stripes, might be confused for a fly. We see Bombus rufocinctus, and my my good friends that are better bee taxonomists would always tell me that whenever you can't identify something, just call it rufocinctus, but because they're just really tricky to ID. More Lacea glossa, and then of course the Bombus huntii. And I would hazard a guess that if you're listening to this talk tonight, it means that you notice bees, and I'm most certain that you've probably seen Bombus huntii, because they are one of the most abundant species we have in this province. So again, this was just from a study that Lincoln did within the bee boulevard, and so it's pretty impressive. And if you imagine going across the province and what an incredibly mixed landscape we have, from agricultural to aspen, you know, prairie, wildflowers, meadows, up to boreal forest, there would be huge shifts in this diversity. So especially coming towards boreal forest, like where I live, we'd have a much greater abundance of bumblebees, because bumblebees are actually account for more than 80% of the pollination within those types of habitats, within forested habitats. So if we look at sort of the big players in the pollination field across Canada, we see that we've got large proportions of, you know, megachilidae, andrenids, and halictids, and I'm going to highlight these. So mining bees versus leafcutter bees and mason bees. The halictids are the sweat bees. And then some plaster bee species, and of course, glorious bumblebees, along with honeybees. So.
Hey,
So
Lexi.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. We've just got our first question. We've got a Miss Toffelmeyer asking, how many honeybee species are there that you're aware of?
I actually don't know. As far as, you know, I know there are a few of them, but we talk about subspecies of honeybees. And, you know, so as far as how many are in Alberta, I would have no clue about the number of honeybees that are, or the number of different honeybee species there would be in Alberta. I only know of the honey, Apis melliformis. So, yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Oh, I'm getting a thunderstorm right now. So anyways, so the halictids, the sweat bees, and so these are just some examples of the ones I've seen around here. This one in particular, I got to be close, intimate with because she kept stinging my back one day when I was driving home. And so this left little pink welts up and down my back, but so it wasn't a very nasty sting like being stung by a bumblebee. And then these neat sweet-coated bees, they are actually a kleptoparasite, so they actually parasitize other bees by getting into their nests. And then we have things like this Agapossum species. And Lincoln was actually really excited about this bee. He wasn't sure if it was a species that had been described yet. I never took any samples of it beyond photographs, but I can show you this cool little picture because, you know, we talk about them being bees that will excavate their own places to live, but this one is nesting in my pipe for my my dryer, and so here it's running across my hand, and it's just really, oops, it's not gonna let me play. It's just really neat to see like these almost like flying shiny green emeralds flying around in the yard, just spectacular really. So I was very excited to have this living in my yard. And the other thing, you know, we talk about the effects of climate change, and you know, whether you believe in it or not, it doesn't really change the facts for these organisms that have very, very specific phenology or timing of when they emerge. And so, you know, these beautiful green bees, they come out on almost the exact same day every year. And I know that because whenever I go to my Facebook memories, it's like, oh, my green bee is back. And it'll be, you know, plus or minus 2 days, my green bee is back. And this year it came back. And as most of you have to have observed, there was just absolutely no food available for it. So it's certainly concerning as you know, these organisms have an evolved behavior and timing, and it has to really match their floral resources. Okay, now I have andrenid bees, so mining bees, and plasterer bees. This was a picture sent to me by one of my students, and I've had this sent to me before. And what's neat about this andrena, and I am trying to focus on showing you pictures of things that I've seen locally because that's most relevant to you. So I didn't want to be Googling images of something that was found in South America or something. But this beauty right here, she's right in Calgary again. She's sitting on some buffalo berry. This was taken a couple weeks ago, and she looks like she's a bumblebee. I mean, she's a larger mining bee, and she has all that bright orange fluff, but she's definitely an andrenid. And then, of course, the plasterer bees are really neat because their saliva is actually like saran wrap. So it's like they salivate all over their tunnels. So they're digging these holes and they're lining it with this plastic-like substance to keep the moisture out. So it's really quite spectacular. This is out of a paper. I'll leave the link on here in case you check that out, but it's really neat to see the products of that. And then this video shows you, I was out in the Weasel Head and I was trying to get some good video of mining bees, and you can see at first it looks like flies swarming, but now you can see, if you watch it a few times, you can see that there's actually this aggregation of holes everywhere, and that those are actually bees that are flying around to back to their little holes. So it's interesting because even though we could call them solitary bees, oftentimes they nest in aggregations, and whether that means having a whole bunch of holes in the same place, like many plasterer bees will do, so that they might see a whole bunch of holes if you're walking along a riparian area with sandy soils, or whether you have sort of common holes that many different solitary bees will be going through, and then they all kind of go off to their own little private chambers, like a condominium. So like I said, even though it's a solitary lifestyle per se, and that they're not forming colonies, there's lots of sort of semi-social behavior where they'll kind of guard each other's offspring while one of them's out foraging and looking for food and so on. So it's neat. And in each of those nests, they'll be putting like an egg and some kind of pollen and nectar blob, and blocking off their little chamber for their next one. So it's really neat.
We've got a couple questions.
All right.
Beverly is wondering, do we have mason bees in Alberta?
Oh, yes, we do. Yeah.
I figured you'd cover those in a bit. Um, and we have another question from one of our young listeners. Where do bees hibernate during the winter?
It depends. And so, I mean, you can have situations where you've got things that are like bumblebees, for instance. You would have queens that would be at the end of last season, any new queens, so they have to be just new, made at the end of last fall, for instance. They would have a great big meal, mate, and then they would go and hibernate somewhere. And it's usually down in old rodent holes and things like that. So just again, through evolution, that was just what they would look for, is these places that would insulate them through the winter. Certainly now they'll hibernate in the cracks in the foundation of your house if you have an older home like me, or other places like that. But and then other bees, you might have them overwintering in hollow stems, or in under the ground again, as different stages of their life cycle. So it just depends on the species. And again, with over 300 different types of bees, it's be very specific.
Fair enough. Last question. What date does your green bee usually arrive?
It is, oh gosh, I should know this because I was posted. Ginny, you should know because I put it on Facebook. It was, I think, 2 weeks ago. It was around the first or second week of May. Yeah.
Nice.
Okay. Yeah, but
We're
it's
good.
amazing. I'll look it up.
Okay.
All right. And so, yeah, we're talking about Megachilidae, so leafcutter bees and mason bees. Again, I just focused on things I actually had pictures of, but, this would include our for them for sure. Here's I love this because here's a female mason bee and here's a male mason bee, and the way you can differentiate the male from the female is that the male has these big fluffy sort of pads on its front legs, and when they're mating, he actually will come along and he'll stroke her eyeballs gently with these lovely, I call them lovin' mitts because they look like big oven mitts, but they're for mating. And then I took this video. This is out of my mom's yard because she always has the best native bee diversity that I've seen. She lives near the Bee Boulevard, and so she has this yard that's very big and it's kind of gone rather natural over the last decade or so. So you can see here where she is cutting these circles, and she does it so quickly, and then she'll actually wrap it up into this kind of like rolling up a sleeping bag and flies off. So she'll go back to whatever tube or hollow structure she's nesting in, and she'll put in the leaves. She'll also lay down some provisions, so again a pollen and nectar blob, and lay an egg and seal it off with more leaves, and keep adding these to that tube. They can control the sex of their offspring by whether or not they withhold sperm, and so what they'll do is just stock those tubes so that you have males coming out at one point and females coming out at one point, because the females take longer to gestate. And it's things like that you want to consider when you're buying things like bee hotels too. So is making sure that you have structures that are deep enough to kind of ensure that they have that time to get out before the bee that's behind them is done, or it might munch its way through it. So. And of course, within the apidae, so it would include bumblebees and honeybees. And I have about 100 million photos and videos of bumblebees and their, of course, amazing and awesome behavior. One of the ones I wanted to highlight here is this bumblebee you can see flicking out its middle leg. And this is actually a common behavior. So I've seen a lot of little videos and cute things like, oh, I helped this bee out of a pond and it high-fived me, and it wasn't at all. When a bee flips its middle leg at you, it basically is kind of like that, get lost. And so it's a warning gesture that all bees, from what I can tell, because I've been flipped the middle leg by many different species of bee, and it's a warning to say, please back off, or I might sting you. I don't want to sting you. So they're very polite about it. They're very docile, but push comes to shove, they're telling you to quit touching them. This video here is just a glorious Nevada bumblebee frenzy of feeding, and so I had to include it. I won't play the whole thing, but you can see like how quickly they're just incredible pollinators. The amount of nectar they can consume and the amount of pollen they can carry in such a short period of time, that just they're incredibly efficient. And then this video, this is one that again I love showing when I'm teaching kids, but usually parents as well are like, oh, play it again, play it again. So this is one of my bumblebee nest boxes. It's out on my back porch, and here you can see that great big queen just shoved her way out, and she's actually going to swing her abdomen around and poop. And so it's just not something you see every day. I just happened to be videotaping at the time when this occurred. But again, you can really see the size difference between these tiny workers, because bumblebees are colony forming insects for the most part, except for cuckoo bees, but we'll talk about that later. But then you see this huge huge queen, pardon me, that comes out. So a huge size differential there. And when you make these nest boxes, the bees will never defecate inside the boxes. They always come outside, and so you can tell the size of your colony by how much waste is on the outside of it. These are just other, and when Ginny posts this, you'll be able to look at some of these videos longer for your own viewing pleasure, and plus you can always email me for copies of them. But this is one of my favorite colonies last summer, a Bombus vagans colony. And what's happening here, you're seeing lots of bees swarming. So right there, that's a male. He wants to come in there. And you'll notice there's a whole bunch of males dive bombing this box, but the workers won't let them in, because all workers are actually female. And so they do all the foraging and making all the honey, whereas males, they just want to mate, as you can see here. And so those males are all just basically stalking all the new queens that are coming out. And this is a brand new queen that you're looking at here, where she's kind of gyrating her abdomen. So she's just fresh out of the womb, so to speak. And you just saw that male dive bomber. He wanted to try to mate with her, and so they're all coming around, and eventually, she's just gonna be like, really, I'm so not ready for this. And so she actually just turns around and goes back inside the nest. And I can't really presume that that's what she's thinking, but that's what I'd be thinking. So, and you can see all the, again, like, look at all the feces that are around the outside of this box. So when I finally opened this up in October, it was just a massive, wonderful colony. Lots of new workers came out of it. And then just a quick, oops, this won't play for me here. This poor queen, well, I shouldn't say poor, because she's mated, which means that she'll go off and hibernate for the winter. And so right now, hopefully she is somewhere. Right now she's trying to get back to her nest box, and those workers are guarding the colony. They'll use their antennae to make sure that anyone that's coming to this nest box is actually supposed to be there. So. The center graphic comes from the Alberta Native Bee Council, and in particular, Megan Evans. So she's, incredible, and she does all these graphics. So this is something that she worked on for years, was just coming up with a really straightforward, user-friendly guide to identifying our bumblebee species. And so we actually have over 30 species of bumblebees here in Alberta, which is incredible and awesome. And like I said, given their importance within boreal forest ecosystems, it also makes sense. And so this guide, if you're looking for, you see a bumblebee and you take note of its color patterns, it's a pretty darn good way of coming up with who's who in the bumblebee zoo. So if you're interested in any of these resources, you can go to the Alberta Native Bee Council link, and you'll find all of those there. Still learning how to use these. So why does native bee diversity matter? Why do we need all these species? I mean, I think the easiest answer is that any biodiversity is imperative to the health of an ecosystem. If you think about, you look at the size differential between all these bees, that's a pretty good indicator that they would pollinate all different sizes, different species of plants. And so, a perdita might come in and just steal the nectar off of a scorpion weed and be very ineffective at, doing much else, where, other bees can get right in there. And so it just, having a greater diversity means that you're going to have a more dynamic sort of array of niches. And I guess what I mean by that is that suppose you took out a species, suppose one species disappears, and we're seeing that now. So certain species of bumblebees, one gets wiped out, we don't necessarily notice that it's missing because there's other species filling that role. And so that's easier for the generalists, but certainly not so for specialist bees. And so where we see decline in specialist species, bee species, pardon me, we will see decline in those plants. You know, in my research, I was looking at how logging activity affected bumblebee populations, so both their abundance and their diversity. And what I found was that in heavily logged habitats, you know, we focus on the clear cut being the disturbance, whereas the forested area is hypothetically the pristine, intact habitat. But what we actually found was that there were so many bees hanging out in the clear cuts that we didn't have the bees in the forest patches anymore, even though there was lots of flowers. And over time, there was actually a decline in the plant abundance and diversity in response to that logging. So, you know, the more diversity you have, the more resilient ecosystem is to certain things like diseases or you know, or competition and so on. Certainly, if these bees have evolved with our ecosystems, they're so much better adapted to be here. So you'd find them foraging earlier in the season, as well as earlier in the morning and later at night, and later into the season, just because of that adaptation. And again, bumblebees are sort of the queens of that. They're incredibly hairy, so they carry huge pollen loads, very fast. They have all different tongue lengths, and they do all of this for free. So we don't have to pay for these bees, having them imported and replacing them and so on. So, you know, their diversity is paramount. Looking at some of the crops that they are responsible for pollinating. And in some cases, we can have, you know, specialist relationships again. So you can have squash bees that are responsible for pollinating squash. You can have sunflower bees that are responsible for pollinating sunflowers. So there's, you know, all sorts of really neat specialist relationships as well. We also know that there's been well-documented, you know, declines in bee populations, and these are all, you know, all come back to the same smoking gun. So habitat loss, parasites and pathogen spillovers, so disease, and pesticide uses, so the neonicotinoids. Lack of flowers and competition for those resources, which I guess you could argue that links right back up to the habitat loss and degradation. So, you know, these are all things, you know, people are always looking for the one smoking gun, but really it's that whole synergistic effect of all of these things combined that is leading to the decline in these populations. So habitat loss, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, a glacier went through and wiped out the habitat, but it can mean that you take a beautiful, you know, normally wildflower range, and it gets turned into agricultural land. And so agricultural intensification is certainly something that's, you know, quite evident across Alberta. And then you see these tiny remnant patches of natural area. But, you know, equal to that, or maybe not equal, but certainly growing, is this urban sprawl. So here you see agricultural land being converted to these little neighborhoods, and again, just pockets of natural habitat. Here we can see maps that are showing this sort of sprawl, so from 1960 to 2010, to the sprawl of Calgary heading out towards Highway 22, which I can't imagine because I live in Turner Valley, predicted by the year 2060. So, you know, all of this is just showing you that this habitat is being altered incredibly. And again, you still have greenery, but, you know, look at that agricultural area. You now have this very homogenized landscape, so one type of crop being planted here and there, but it's still, it's a bunch of flowers, the same type of flowers that are there for a much shorter period of time. Oops, I don't know how these are animated. And so some studies have shown that, coupled with agriculture, certainly the introduction of millions upon millions of honeybees, and these studies have shown like decreases in native bumblebee densities by up to 80%. So we're displacing these bees. It doesn't mean they're gone, it just means they've moved. And where have they moved? Have they moved into the remnant native forest patches? Have they moved into the urban settings? For people like me that love to plant glorious native plant gardens, I would hope so. Right? Some studies have certainly shown our urban cities and towns as being like little lifeboats to native diversity and abundance. And in fact, there's higher diversity and abundance found in our urban settings than found in agricultural or even surrounding natural areas of agricultural activity. So just, some of our locally documented species that are listed. And if you've seen any of the ads for the Earth Rangers, then you should know the Western bumblebee. And I can't even describe how I felt when I saw my first Western bumblebee. And, understand that I spent a few years of my life just walking through forests and clear cuts all day long, every day. I know it sounds terrible, but it was just kidding. It was amazing. And looking for bees and counting flowers. And so when I saw my first Western bumblebee, it was just amazing. But what's striking is that this was the most abundant bumblebee in Alberta. Much like Bombus huntii is now, and yet in my I saw 4 of them that I recorded in my first 2 years of fieldwork. What was neat was that when I'd come back to my hometown, Turner Valley, I actually saw them all the time, and it turned out that they were nesting and in healthy populations within Turner Valley, and that lasted up until about 4 years ago. And then something changed, and being apparently a sensitive species, I haven't seen them since, and so that was very disheartening for me. And of course, Bombus bohemicus, we're going to talk about that one in a minute, but this is one that was also recently rediscovered, and that'll go back to talking about that glorious native bee boulevard in Calgary. So that was the gypsy cuckoo and bumblebee. And so these two, these are like friend and foe. And so a cuckoo bee is one that will parasitize another bee. And so the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee is a kleptoparasite of the Western bumblebee. And it was never one that was in huge abundances, but what they found was that when the Western bumblebee populations declined, we didn't find these at all anymore. So one of the things we know is that parasites or kleptoparasites are actually indicators of healthy ecosystems. So a bumble or a subspecies I quite often see is called the evil Cytherus, and it's a kleptoparasite. So they go in and they lay their eggs. They kill the queen because they have a stronger exoskeleton and stinger, and they'll kill the queens, and then they lay their eggs inside the colony, and the workers there will rear these bees as if they're their own sisters. And of course, when they start emerging, it's all mayhem, and of course the colony then collapses. So, but again, you wouldn't have these kleptoparasites if you didn't have hosts for them. So they are arguably an indicator that something is happening. So how can we actually help these bees in the face of all of these struggles that they're dealing with? And it all comes down to habitat. And so really it's not just planting flowers, but it's also having places for them to nest, something that's increasingly difficult in urban sort of concrete jungles. And just having good practices that are going to help them. And one really good example, or phenomenal example, I had the good fortune, and I don't even know how it happened, and Ginny, certainly if Dave Misfeld decides to make any comments, please allow him, but it was his vision. So he's with the city of Calgary, and he actually has nothing to do with parks and nothing to do with sort of the naturalization. He was with roads and road maintenance, but he kept driving by this area of Canyon Meadows, and he saw it was just waste habitat. I forget what he called it, but it just existed. And so he asked his boss, hey, can maybe we turn this into some nice bee habitat? I just had this vision, so to speak. And his boss absentmindedly, I suppose, said, yeah, sure, go for it. And not realizing that he just unleashed the beast, because what Dave did with this area, it's probably a 1 or 2 kilometer stretch all along Canyon Meadows Drive. on the Bonavista Vista, the east side. And he used largely recycled components. So all of this is actually crushed old concrete. And I'll show you a picture of this in my next slide. But all of these, native plants and flax. In the background, you can see a bee hotel. This is a really cool thing. I think Lincoln Best said his dad made it for him. But when you look inside, you can see all these channels for leaf cutter bees. So it was just this incredible expanse of habitat where it's all native plants all along the walkway. He's got logs that city volunteers went along and they drilled holes in all of these logs, thousands and thousands and thousands of logs, and they did it all on their own time. And I wish I had the better pictures that Dave had sent me, but I couldn't find them. But this shows you his vision for that first garden. It was to look like a flower, and so each of these petals were those I'll go back here, were those pads of flax and so on. So I forget what he said. There's some missing because he was playing He Loves Me Not. So that's the empty spot. But there's also bare sandy soil patches here for mining bees to nest in. And so it was just an extraordinary effort. It's commendable. And that's where they discovered, and this made the news last year, I'm not sure if any of you heard it, but that this, rediscovered the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee was back in town. And so it was just a really amazing project. And then to have that big payoff of, not only attracting this incredible diversity of over 100 different species, but look at these ones that we haven't seen in over a decade, they're back. So it's really remarkable. Mount Royal University, because that's where I am from. We also have had quite a native plant garden initiative, and so we came up with our own. We sort of branched off, and we have the Plan B initiative. So I know that U of C is a bee city campus. We were really focused, and our point was to make sure we didn't send any mixed messaging about what our specifically science-based conservation strategies. So how would we manage the habitats that we don't have any kind of, any conflicting things. And so certainly, I'll get into this in a bit, but we certainly didn't want to have any connection with any kind of bringing in of non-native species or so on, sort of the more glamorous things, which sometimes you need those glamorous components to attract people to be interested in bees in general. But we wanted this to just try to be as natural and focus on the native species as we could. So we have these huge plant gardens that extend all around the side of the recreation building. We also have a dry pond area that we brought in, again, through Dave Misfeld, a ton of these great big huge old logs that we've been drilling for more nesting habitat, and it's just been really neat to watch the bees show up as we go. So but then here's where we get into the problems of media and well-meaning. But one of the things that popped up a few days ago when I started putting my talk together for tonight, I gotta make sure that I really highlight Dave's incredible hard work, and so I just quickly Googled image for maybe some extra images, and this is what popped up. And so this is Calgary's Bee Boulevard, and it's through breakfast television, so everybody was gonna see it. And lo and behold, what we have on the front is honeybees, and honeybees, of course, are not native species. We don't have any native honeybee species in North America, so we have our annual species, but these ones, in Africa and Europe and so on, they can live for years, and which is why they produce so much, tons of glorious honey. But they are imported here, and they have been though for hundreds of years. So it's certainly one thing that I get asked a lot of times is, does beekeeping help the bees? Because you look at things like this that you see on the internet, and it talks about planting flowers and weeds aren't all that bad and don't use chemicals and all things I would 100% agree with. But then we get to, learn how to be a beekeeper and understand that honeybees are good. And yes, definitely honeybees aren't out to get you, but is learning to be a beekeeper the best for actually helping the bees? And so, in short, I would argue that the answer to that is actually no. They're not part of nature. They're certainly wonderful, and they're great for crop pollination just due to their sheer numbers. So you have, a bumblebee colony might be, for some of the smaller species, maybe only 20 or 30 bees, and some of the larger, you get up to 100 or 200. And I have another good friend, Sarah Johnson, who found colonies as high as 500 bees in them. So that's spectacular. But a honeybee colony, we're looking at, tens of thousands of bees. So quite a bit different, right? Now, I mean, I've had people argue to me like, well, we've certainly had honeybees here for a very long time, and that is very true. I mean, we have a long history with them. So back in 1924, we had roughly 22,000 beekeepers across Canada. And so they were looking after around 280,000 colonies, and this made almost 17 million pounds of honey. But Ontario was pretty much responsible for the majority of that. And then in the 40s, beekeeper numbers started to rise to over something like 27,000. 27,000, yeah, I think. I hope that's right. And they actually aided in part of the war effort. So when sugar was scarce, and they also used beeswax on the ammunition belts, so there was this need for it. In the 60s, beekeeping started to move west, and then the prairie provinces began to produce sort of double what Ontario was producing. And so Alberta actually became one of the most important provinces for honey production until a huge varroa mite outbreak in 1989. And again, I mean, you think about other examples of the introduction of monocultures within ecosystems. I mean, lodgepole pine and the plantations of huge tracts of land with nothing but lodgepole pine, and then looking at mountain pine beetle outbreaks. That's another good example of what happens when we get too reliant on a monoculture. So that curbed it a bit, but I think in 2017, the number of beekeepers was around almost 800,000 beekeepers across Canada, and 43% of those are in Alberta. So with respect to urban honeybee keeping, so now we're talking about within municipalities, and keep in mind what I told you about how our urban settings are native bee lifeboats, if you will. So again, we have this huge diversity of arguably displaced species of bees hanging out gratefully in our gardens, and I've sure seen a huge shift in the mindset of people, and I see yards that are packed with dandelions and so on, and I'd love to think that if I stopped and looked at any of those, I'd see nothing but native species. But we've seen a tenfold increase in backyard beekeeping. So in Calgary alone, they went from having about 120 hives 10 years ago to now there's over 1,400 just in Calgary alone, right? And so, why is this so concerning? If you look at how much a single colony can consume, it's enough to feed over 100,000 solitary bees. So if you put 40 hives into a wildland habitat for a few months, that's enough food that would have fed over 4 million native bees. And with well-documented declines, and certainly in many of our bumblebee species, what's happening to our less charismatic species, so ones that we're not keeping as close an eye on, certainly solitary bees, right? A lot of municipalities group urban beekeeping with backyard chickens, and it's an interesting thing to me because and I love that picture of the chickens. I forgot to put a photo credit, but certainly you can't equate to keeping chickens. They're not songbirds, or certainly keeping chickens would not help songbirds any more than keeping honeybees will help native bees. But certainly we could have negative impacts from that. When you have backyard chicken keeping, chickens don't tend to leave the yard, and certainly they can fly. I don't want to discredit their ability. I've read things that they can fly over 7 or 8 feet into the air and hop fences and sit on your roof if they're looking for food or for shelter or what have you. But typically they stay in your yard. But what about a honeybee? And you bring in your one colony and you have tens of thousands of honeybees. And those honeybees, within a crop system, that one colony would need about a quarter acre or half acre of area to have enough flowers. But oftentimes, when someone brings in honeybees, they haven't converted their entire land that they own, nor do they even possess enough land to actually sustain that honeybee. So it's going to spread out into the surrounding neighborhood, other people's homes. When they run out of food, they tend to get, a little more aggressive, but again, they are very docile. Another concern is certainly the spread of disease. And so when honeybees that have diseases are visiting flowers, those flowers are like little cesspools, if you will, of different viruses and mites and so on. So you've got this sugary substance that is the nectar, and it's a perfect breeding ground for disease, right? And so they're all getting their grubby little feet in there, and as other native species come in, they're much more negatively impacted by these diseases, especially like bumblebees with deformed wing virus and so on. So the spread of diseases, pathogen spillover is well documented within native species with proximity to managed bees. And that's not just honeybees. So we look at managed bumblebees that are brought in for tomatoes, and we can see similar things. Also, there's a decline in the foraging efficiency of native species. And so if you've got an area where you now have tens of thousands of honeybees, all bees are rather docile, but certainly our native species, I don't know why this keeps skipping, are far more docile. And so if they have it'd be kind of like if you decided to go shopping for your loved one's present on Christmas Eve, you can go into Walmart and there might be lots of things for you to forage on or to buy, but if there's tens of thousands of humans around, you just want to get out of there, and you're going to go to some crappy little convenience store and buy them the plastic rose, and, and so you will not have foraged efficiently, and your reproductive output will pay. And so these native species now have to fly much further and forage on far less beneficial plants, probably maybe less numerous, and so this is a huge energy expenditure. And plus then they're away from their larvae, they're young for longer periods, which then leads them to fall prey to parasites, right? So parasitic wasps and so on. So these are all some of the negative impacts. Other considerations, I just was having fun here, but certainly we don't have to worry about mutant chicken attacks, but I did watch the video. But we would have to consider that we know that honeybees will swarm when their numbers get higher, when they're hungry and so on. And so it's not that they're going to swarm a human, but how do you deal with the removal of those swarms? And so that becomes then an expense. Also, when honeybees are nesting in structures, this can lead to huge structural damage with the having to remove honeycombs and so on. So there's those expenses as well. And really, about 2% of the population, this is what I haven't actually followed, I have to check on these statistics, but is allergic to these bee stings. And so having these huge numbers of bees within your neighborhood, if they're not being well fed, it could lead to greater risks of stinging. And so there's all of these things to consider. Are you going to make sure that if someone takes a colony that they're going to turn their yard into nothing but flowers, or how many hives would you have in that neighborhood? So if I get a hive and my neighbor gets a hive and that neighbor gets a hive, that would be an extraordinary number of bees. And I do regularly get phone calls throughout the summer like, oh, my kids can't go in the pool today because there's just so many honeybees in it, and so how do I deal with that? And these are things that, given the huge increase in the number of bees we're bringing in, something we need to consider, right? So how do we actually help these bees? We feed them. So you want to make sure that you're giving these bees as much as possible native plants, hopefully plants that haven't been treated with chemicals. So apparently some suppliers do treat their plants with chemicals. I was told Home Depot does, but I have to look into that. Having mass flowering crops is essential. So, not just the odd one or two flowers, but if you can get things that have that produce, significant amounts of flowers. And then having those flowers, April through September. Nowadays, it seems like it'd be more like May through September because our seasons seem to be shifting, but so that they have some of these early spring things. So willows are an incredible source of protein with the pollen on them. Kinnick, if you're dealing with more of a, like shaded area, or crocuses, your dandelions arguably, and then carrying on through the summer. Avoiding the use of pesticides, and having lots of different nesting resources. So I know you can't read this, but you could check it out on our Bee Council Facebook page. It's much more readable and printable. This is a really great list of all the different, or some of the different native plants that you could use to naturalize your yard for promoting the presence and the sustenance of these species. This little graphic up here is from xerces.org, and so it's a great way, having your yard have some complex topography to it, so hills and slopes, little bits of water, plants with hollow stems, having bare ground. So all of these things are going to help to entice a diversity of organisms. So really it's about a change of mindset. And so, getting away from this idea that having this stagnant, biologically useless habitat right here. I mean, I guess you could play rugby on it, which would make it okay, but if you're not, then forget it. I turned my whole side yard into this native plant garden, and this was a day after weeding, whereas normally it looks a little more like this, so it's a bit of mayhem, but this is basically the exact same location about a month later. But at any rate, these are all flowers that they always have some kind of a pollinator in them. I get hummingbirds, and once the delphinium grows, I get huge amounts of just every bumblebee. It's glorious. Avoiding those pesticides. Oops. So you can see here, my kids are holding handfuls of dead bumblebees after an application of pesticides, which was actually herbicides, but they classify them as pesticides. And even though they can't figure out, or I have yet to read a document that gives me the specific chemical, smoking gun in that, every single time these signs came up, I would be able to pick up these handfuls of bees. And when you're dealing with a colony forming social insect like a bumblebee, every dead queen is actually functionally dozens or maybe even hundreds of dead bees, right, when the colony fails. So, if it's your garden you're dealing with, doing things like edging your garden, that creates little edges for mining bees to burrow into. Limit your mulching so you don't destroy those little tunnels that they build. Again, avoiding using chemicals. And of course, the best part is just leaving your yard waste. I'm the laziest person, in the world when it comes to my gardening. You can ask my neighbors, it'll look like hell by the end of September, and it'll stay that way until June. And whenever they say, "What are you doing?" I'm just like, "Oh, I'm just helping the bees, man. Like, gotta keep all this yard waste here so that there's things for them to hibernate in, and stems for them to hibernate in, and so on." So it really does promote healthy ecosystems within your little garden, and leaving areas in your yard natural. So if you let the grass grow in an area, leaving bare patches, maybe even chuck in a bag or two of sand to have it go in, you'll attract different types of mining bees through doing that as well. There's some great resources out there. So Dave Misfeld sent me this morning, the buzz on getting a bee-friendly lawn, but there's lots of these really good resources, and you'd want to try to find ones that are of local. So you don't want to be looking on how to get a bee-friendly lawn in the UK. You want to know, what can I do here in Calgary or Okotoks and so on. So. And again, when you look at all of the different nesting strategies that we've talked about, having this diversity of topography and presence of plants and so on, it will generate this nice diversity in what you have living there. And when you learn to appreciate your local bees, and like I said, that do the lion's share of pollination, so there's lots of well-documented studies that show that they actually are doing a bang-up job. So you don't have to bring in honeybee colonies to get this job done.
Hey, Lexi, I'm just going to jump in quick.
For sure.
We do have one question about habitat. What size of holes could we drill into logs for habitat, and how deep should they be?
So Lincoln Best told me that usually the best used ones are around 1/4 inch. And so if you want to get bees, that's actually the best size to get. And you want to make sure, I think I have to try to remember again. I think it's like 6 inches deep, but you also want to make sure that they're sealed on the other end, so that you only have that bee coming in and putting her eggs in from one end. Otherwise, like I said, you could have a case where one emerges, it undergoes metamorphosis and comes out before the other, and then eats its way through them all, and that would be very tragic. So, does that answer?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Here's a bumblebee nest box. Again, if you're interested in this, this plans, and I'll show you this in a second, but the plans for these nest boxes are on the Alberta Native Bee Council site under our resources link. This was one I had out in the forest because I had nest boxes all through Kananaskis. But again, here you can see all the feces of the bees, so they're very tidy inside their nests. Here you can see a male mating with a female, a guard bee, and this was on a hot day, so they come outside and they vibrate their muscles to try and cool off. They fan themselves with their wings. So there's just so much neat behavior when you get to watch. And some people are bird watchers, but I think if they saw what bees do, they'd become bee watchers. Right. This is what it looks like inside of a bumblebee colony, and you can see their little honey pots. So a lot of people don't know that bumblebees produce honey, and we can't eat it because they don't produce enough for us. They're annual species, so they really only make enough honey to get through a few days. But it's still, I took an eyedropper and I tasted this honey, and it was just like heaven. So here's a great link for, dealing with, the guide, that what I showed you for the different bumblebee species you can find, the guide for how to make a bumblebee nest box, best practices for these bee hotels. So what you were just asking me about, Ginny, there's so many pictures and what have you on the internet of what to make, but you want to make sure that you're not going to buy something that is actually a sink for the bee. And I can tell you right now that if you're buying something with pine cones in it, that's actually kind of no value to our bees anyway. So that's coming from Ken Fry with the Entomological Society of Alberta. So things like this are good because you can clean them out. So this was one that Lincoln Best made. This is at the Bee Boulevard. Each of these come out, and you can see he's got them drilled all different sizes to attract all different species of bee. But it was sealed on the back so that nothing can come around the other end. This is another one. I like this one. This is one I have on my yard because you see that all of my channels are actually lined with a nice biodegradable paper straw, and so these can be pulled out because it's really important that you clean these out at the end of the seasons, and that we're not going to do something where we're introducing mites or viruses to subsequent generations. So these are all things to consider. This is a little insert from that best practices for bee hotels. Again, this is another fine work by Megan Evans. So but yeah, so it's just really good practice. You don't need something big and flashy. Having smaller things like this around, you're going to be doing, or will be more beneficial to your insects. You don't have to, or your bees, you don't have to worry about attracting predators, different parasitic wasps and things. If you have these smaller things, they're sort of fly under the radar, if you will. Right? And that's that. Oh, and then I was supposed to address if a bee stings you, does it die? And this actually shows you, this is the stinger of a honeybee. They're more recently evolved than most of our native species, all of our native species. And so they have a serrated stinger. And so when that sticks into a person, it hooks in, and then as they try to fly away, it rips out her guts. So here you can see she's flying away, and her guts are being pulled out. So it's quite sad. But from an evolutionarily stable standpoint, that makes sense because she's got tens of thousands of bees in her colony. And so if she dies to make some nasty weasel leave their hive alone, then she will have died for the greater good. If you're a solitary bee and you die, you haven't died for anything. So they have this more of a straight ice pick, if you will, of a stinger, and they can sting over and over and over again, with some exceptions. So yes, they don't die when they sting you. It's just honeybees that do. So all right.
Awesome. Thanks, Lexi. That was really great. We have one question. Someone's wondering if there are any types of native bee that actually choose a new queen.
So what do you mean by choose a new queen?
That's just what they wrote. I think they're thinking something similar to honeybees, you know, how they choose queen
Oh, I
bees.
see what you're
You know what I
saying.
mean? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I tend to, I say, okay, well, a new queen comes in the spring and she starts her colony, and then she starts making those wax balls, and she'll control the amount of resources that she gives that wax ball, as well as the sex of it by, if she withholds sperm, fertilizing them, then it'll be a male, but she usually starts with producing lots of female workers. But sometimes if a female worker manages to gets enough resources and enough warmth, and it comes out super big, she can be, like, oh, I'm taking over. What do they call that? Mutiny or treason? I don't know. Anyway, and so they can actually then battle the queen, kill her, and take over the colony. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff like that. Sometimes a colony can even have, two queens if it's a nice big one, and maybe she needs a hand or something.
Oh, that's really cool.
You'll notice that you'll right now you're seeing great big bumblebees, and those are queens, but soon, although depending if we ever get these flowers growing, she'll stop coming out. So you're going to start to notice, think, oh, the bees are smaller now, and that's because the workers are smaller than the queens, and certainly the males are smaller again. So it won't be until late in the summer when we'll start to be great big new queens again. So.
Okay, we have one last question here.
All
Uh,
right.
Krista's asking, my 3-year-old tries to kiss bees. Is there a chance he won't get stung?
Um, there, there is. For one thing, okay. Well, the reason that bees pick up on where you are is because of the carbon dioxide you produce. So it's kind of like the same thing with mosquitoes, and they make those carbon dioxide machines. If you breathe on a bee, you're gonna freak it out and it's gonna fly away. So if you're kissing, make sure you hold your breath. But actually just don't. It's a bit dangerous. Males can't sting though, right? Because I guess I didn't really cover that. But this stinger structure on other insects, that's called an ovipositor. And so that ovipositor is this tube-like thing that insects lay eggs out of. And so when you see spittle bugs and so on leaves or whatever, they're spewing their eggs out of it. But within these wasps and bees and hornets, that got modified into a stinging structure. And so that's why only females can sting, and that's why I detest the Bee Movie. Because
Fair
in the
enough.
Bee Movie, they had that all the males, what was it, Barry and so on, that were doing all the pollinating. It's like, males don't do any work.
We do have a few more questions. People are pouring them in now that we're all done. So I think
Okay.
that's great. So besides having flowers that attract mason bees, what else can you do?
Well, so I mean, I guess like referring back to the nesting habitat and so on, is that?
I'm
So
not sure.
So, I mean, what's really neat, some of the sites that I credit, so discoverlife.org and so on, they're really cool because they'll not only list a species of bee that you might be interested in, but they also will give you a species list of the different plants that they forage on. And so that's really handy. But also, if you do a little bit of digging, and that's where if you go back to that Bees in Your Backyard, that book I was telling you about, it talks a lot about the different. So for instance, if I wanted to attract collated like plaster bees, I might want to pack sandy soil to ensure that they come in. And that might be different if I was trying to get a different type of mason bee. And there was some of the Facebook pages, I think it was Bees of North America or something. This woman had this amazing picture. She was trying to plant like scorpion weed or something, but they were coming in and they're digging their holes, and they ended up killing her plant because they really like that pot of soil. So yeah, it's hit and miss though, right? Like the same thing with putting out a birdhouse. I have birdhouses all over my property, but I only get a couple different ones used every year, and I have I think 17 bumblebee nest boxes in my yard right now. But if I even get 3 colonized in a year, that's big success for me. So.
Awesome. No, I think you answered her question. That's great.
Okay.
One more question here. How far do most native bee species travel to pollinate? Or is
Oh, it
there a
depends.
difference? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, huge difference. So small species don't travel as far as big species. So some of the larger bumblebee species, they could, and they've been recorded as flying as far as like 20 kilometers or more. Usually within about a kilometer of their nest usually accounts for about 80% of their foraging range. And then smaller bees would not travel near as far, right? They're cold-blooded little creatures, so they're ectotherms, and so they have to be able to warm up, and in order to move, like their metabolic activity is tied to that, and so they're not going to stray too far from home because that's just too much energy. They use up too much resources.
Oh, okay, that's cool. And I think I'm able to answer this question from Nicole. Are you able to send the presentation or resource links to us for future reference? So we are recording this whole presentation and I will be uploading it onto the event webpage that you first registered from. So that presentation will be up, or this whole presentation will be up next week, I'm thinking by Tuesday or Wednesday. And there are resource links, as Alexandria said, on the Alberta Native Bee Council website. And I have also posted some on the Pollinator Day webpage from today's event. So you can look there for both those resources. So that is the end of our questions so far. You guys can feel free to post more. I'm just going to ramble on a little bit here with some thank yous and to let you know a little bit more about Environment Week. So just big thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. This is really fun, and thanks so much, Alexandria, for a great presentation. So as I just said, if anyone is interested, everything will be online and available for you. And before anyone goes, I want to let you all know about more upcoming Environment Week events. So tomorrow, Friday, is Green Action Day. It's also World Environment Day. We here in Okotoks want to celebrate it by asking you to nominate someone who you think does really great things for the environment by telling us who they are and what they do that is so positive. So you can also take a photo of them doing this action, or maybe it's yourself, so don't be too modest. Show us how you're trying to make a positive impact on the planet. So there's an online form that can be found at okotoks.ca/environmental events, or you can just email me at sustainability@okotoks.ca. I want to know what all these great Okotokians are doing out there. On Saturday, we're also hosting a smaller portion of our regular repair cafe. It's going to be at the Town Operations Center from 2 to 4 o'clock. We have a volunteer there who's going to do small bike fixes, like a quick bike tune-up or patching a tire, for example. It's going to be first come, first serve. So just look for the tent and the repair cafe sign. So that's it for me. So thanks again, Alexandria. This was wonderful. Great
Thanks for having me.
presentation. It was really fun. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to email me. I can always pass those on to her and she can answer them through me. So stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy and take care. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.